for us, who didn't really realise perhaps all the implications, it was a grand time. And the one we look back to with nostalgia almost. We were dancing in the street until some hours of the night. The weather was glorious, what we call in South Wales strike weather, bright by day and by night. And we danced to the moon, of course, and in those days to a piano or a gramophone.
If they'd have stuck out another couple of days, I think that history of this country would have got its sense of values right. I do believe that. We was left out. We was left out, and we'd lost. We were starved back. We had to submit. And it didn't make things better. As a matter of fact, there was 1 million out of work. In another 2 years, there was nearly 1.5 million. You see what I mean?
Oh, he was a very big man, very well built. He had a back like a wall. And he was very good, you know. Strong. When the strike was over and other trades started to pull up, you know, they went to work. Well, there was nothing at all done for the miners, and they became depressed and bitter. And the effect it had on them when they knew it had collapsed was absolutely devastating. Nobody would believe, you know, that everyone out, that it would last any length of time. Which he did. And he was a different person. After he'd come through it, he was a different person altogether. Much more serious, quiet.
Were martyrs, marching and protesting against what? Against conditions. All they were just wanting a job. They weren't wanting the moon, they weren't wanting less rent, or like we've got today and things like that. They were wanting a job, to become a man again, to become somebody. Because when you're unemployed, it's an awful thing. It feels as if you're not wanted. I've seen them standing, waiting down at the Salvation Army in the lecture hall, the kiddies marching in there. When you see them going up with the bowl and putting the soup in for them, the kids sitting down and eating it, And then when there was any left, they got it. If there was none left, that was all there was for them.
I can remember us going there with a football team to Merthyr, and they put us on an amper at Cardiff, you know, and we're going up to Merthyr, and I remember us getting up to the ground there, you know, and we put this amper on the ground. Well, they opened the amper and they said to these kiddies that, well, I must tell you about the children first. All they had was a jersey on and no socks or shoes, only bare feet, you know. And you see how a pack of seagulls would come down on something beside the beach. Well, that's just how they children raided that big hamper we had with the food in, you know. It was only light meal because we weren't allowed to drink or have anything heavy before playing. And they ravaged on that like a pack of seagulls. And I thought to myself then, what a future. What are we going to do?
I mean, seeing that, and when I look back, makes you wonder what causes all that. We know the strike caused it. But I mean, what caused the strike?
Who in 1918 could have foreseen the pain and the brutality of the 30s? Appearances suggested a future brimming with prosperity and peace. Demobilization had hardly begun. While factories hummed to the tune of export orders, the business community, determined to maintain high wartime profits, indulged in speculation. Takeovers and amalgamations mushroomed. Private capital accumulated in the war stalked the country looking for investment. In this crazed atmosphere, all thought of building a new society on the ashes of the old was swept aside.
When I returned from the war, I expected what the Prime Minister at that time, or the Minister of War, Lloyd George, who had promised everybody that was fighting that it would turn back to a land fit for heroes to live in. Also, if it was needed, some should be given 3 acres and a cow to start off life, and to live something on a decent way of civilization.
Though a small minority had further enriched itself, the artificial post-war boom was soon over. By April 1920, there was no more dancing in the streets. World competition forced prices down, and unemployment rose immediately. British industry was in deep crisis, and strikes were commonplace.
Now, this revolutionary feeling was there from 1917 onwards. It was the consequence of the total disaster of the First World War, and it was partly fomented by returning soldiers. It was, in a way, enormously encouraged by the success of the Russian Revolution. This was felt to be then the first breakthrough of the proletariat into power on a Marxist basis. And it's very difficult for any political party of the left in this country after 1917 to deny the Russian Revolution. The problem was for it to establish whether it was in favor of a similar event in Britain.
Before the war, the Triple Industrial Alliance had been founded, uniting the miners, the railwomen, and the transport workers. It was potentially a formidable weapon. The coal owners were the first employers to test its strength.
The coal owners, they were nothing but taskmasters. You had to get coals out. You were under their dictatorship and you durst not back answer them. Or put your coat on, out the bloody pit you get.
The landowning Duke of Northumberland derived an income of £200 per day from coal mined on his estates. £200 was equal to the daily wages of 440 miners. Lord Dunraven's income from coal was £123 per day. The Ecclesiastical Commission's £769 per day. A miner's average daily wage was 11 shillings.
You had to keep your head down. If you forgot to keep your head down, you would lose your head. Do you know that we had a laddie, the second day down the pit, he had his head taken off by there? Do you know that? And I'll tell you what the coal owners offered the widow. She was a widow of the First World War, £15 burial fees. £15 burial fees.
But the pit went on the next day just the same as if it never happened. Human life was cheap. They could do just what they liked. They had the power. They not only had the economic power, but they had the political power too.
The struggle in the coal industry sharpened in 1919. The miners demanded an increase in wages, shorter hours, and nationalization of mines and minerals with a degree of workers' control. The government, which had controlled the mines since the war, was immediately implicated. Unwilling to challenge the Triple Alliance, Lloyd George asked the miners to postpone strike action and join a commission to investigate conditions in the industry and the larger question of nationalization. Against strong rank-and-file opposition, the miners' executive agreed. Sir John Sankey was called to chair the new commission. His interim report, advising on wages and conditions, strongly favoured the miners. The owners, on the other hand, were wholly discredited. So was the prevailing system of ownership. This encouraged the miners, who withdrew strike notices on the strength of the report and the government's pledge to carry out, in the spirit and in the letter, the recommendations of the Sankey Commission. When the final reports appeared, the majority, including Sir John Sankey's, advocated nationalization as the only long-term solution for the industry. But Lloyd George, seizing on the absence of unanimity, broke his government's pledge and refused to nationalize. The miners had been duped, but worse was to come. A few months later, when the miners put in for a wage increase to offset rising prices, their leaders negotiated a temporary agreement to expire in March 1921. During this truce, the government armed itself against future industrial upheavals with the Emergency Powers Act, rushed through Parliament with uncommon haste. Then, without warning, the government announced their intention to relinquish control of the mines. The owners reacted instantly with wage cuts of between 40 and 49%. Lockout notices were posted in the coalfields, while the Decontrol Bill was being debated in Parliament. Unions felt that the government's action was an explicit attack upon the whole labor movement. A feeling of unity swept the country. The Triple Alliance issued strike notices to railwomen and transport workers. The government replied with the Emergency Powers Act. Reservists were called to the colours, and a special corps, the Defence Force, was created. Troops were dispatched to large working-class areas. The mines were occupied, machine guns posted at pit heads.
On April 15th, which was a Friday night, we stood in the centre of the town. One of our colleagues was on the tram that came into the town every 40 minutes. And each time it came into this terminus, he jumped off the tram and ran over to our group and told us any information that had come through he was quite enthusiastic. The tram men were going to come out 100%. He was sure of that.
At the negotiating table, Frank Hodges, the miners' representative, advanced behind the back of his own executive a scheme as a basis for further negotiation to which the miners were in principle opposed. The confusion that ensued enabled the other leaders of the alliance to throw in the towel.
Around about 10 o'clock, we saw him drop off the tram, and he came across to us, and we could tell by his droop of shoulders and old demeanour that there was something wrong. And as he came near us, we could hear him swearing, saying the bastards have called it off.
April 15th, 1921, Black Friday, marked the collapse of the Triple Alliance and the beginning of savage wage cuts in every industry. With the Triple Alliance gone, the TUC's newly formed General Council became the prime coordinating body of the trade union movement. Its role in industrial disputes was clear enough, but its executive powers of action were slight and ill-defined. The French occupation of the Ruhr in 1923 launched a period of prosperity in Britain. When the supply of German war reparations coal dried up, British exports rose to record levels. During this brief revival, miners' wages improved. The coal owners' beneficence was not unconnected with the coming to power of the first ever Labour government. It turned out to be starkly conservative in character, with no clear majority in the Commons. A Labour administration, according to a leading Tory, too weak to do much harm, but not too weak to be discredited. Ramsay MacDonald's failure to tackle unemployment was a bitter blow to his supporters. His image as a socialist was stained, and a timely Red Scare easily removed him from office. By the end of 1924, a greatly strengthened Tory government swept into power.
1924, 1925, years of extremes. Labour in, Labour out. Oxford begs, Oxford sinks.
The new Prime Minister caught the public imagination almost immediately, wrote Lord Winterton. His placidity, his common sense, his moderation, his modesty, and his obvious sincerity caused people to say, "This is the man, a typical Englishman, for whom we have been looking for so long." This was to be Stanley Baldwin's longest term in office. His new Chancellor of the Exchequer was Winston Churchill, ex-Tory, ex-Liberal, ex-independent anti-socialist, recently returned to Parliament as a constitutionalist. His politics were no secret. In 1910, Churchill drafted troops and special constables to Turnipandi to put down a miners' strike. From the War Office, he advocated intervention in Russia. Later, he defended the Black and Tans in Ireland. In an attempt to put value back into money, Churchill announced the restoration of the gold standard at pre-war parity with the dollar.
The purpose of this was in order that they might try to put the City of London back into the financial position of power that it held in 1914. It was really quite ridiculous because a war had taken place in which the power of the city in the markets of the world and wasn't what it was, that it didn't. The current conditions did not reflect the position as it was in 1914. This meant that if this bill was carried, which it was, it would mean 10 to 12% increase in the cost of exports. A coal owner wanted to sell coal. Now, he put up his prices in the competitive market by 10 to 12%. That would price him right out of the market and would cause unemployment at home. What, in fact, he did was to turn round and say the already low wages of the miners should be reduced further.
The road may be long and painful, remarked a leading banker, but our fathers trod it before us, and we know the way. Baldwin's problem, said the economist, is to find a formula which will lower wages without appearing to do so. You believe in private enterprise, although private enterprise has failed to function. It's your baby, which you must supply with milk. Challenging the government was typical of Herbert Smith, the ex-miner born in a Yorkshire workhouse, now president of the Miners' Federation. A.J. Cook, after 21 years in the mines, was sponsored by the communist minority movement and elected General Secretary of the miners. Cook was in regular touch with the rank and file. He knew that if it came to a lockout, the miners would stand firm. But Baldwin refused to compromise. All workers of this country have got to take reductions in wages to help put industry on its feet. Now doing, growled Smith. We have naught to give. The coal owners were unmoved. Miners were free to choose either wage cuts or a lockout. Once again, ringing throughout industrial Britain, in every mine, workshop and factory, is the blessed word unity. As the storm clouds gathered, the General Council of the TUC announced plans for a national embargo on the movement of coal to take effect on Friday, 31st of July, 1925, at midnight. There was a semblance of normality at Buckingham Palace. I fear a strike now is inevitable at the end of the week, the King recorded. It will play the devil in the country. The Prime Minister announced a government subsidy of £10 million to run for 9 months while a commission examined the coal industry in detail. So, thank God, there will be no strike now. I'm much relieved. It's a victory for common sense, proclaimed the Times. Red Friday, sang the Daily Herald. Workers everywhere received the news with jubilation. Black Friday had been vindicated. This is not finished, warned the Home Secretary. The danger is not over. Sooner or later, this question has got to be fought out by the people of the land. Is England to be governed by Parliament or the Cabinet, or by a handful of trade union leaders? There had been good reason for the unexpected subsidy. Baldwin had not felt ready to face organized industrial action. We have no need to glorify about victory, warned Herbert Smith. It is only an armistice. 30 weeks to go. To what? Asked Communist Workers Weekly. To the ending of the miners' agreement and the opening of the greatest struggle in the history of the British working class. We must prepare for that struggle. I'm going to get a fund that will buy grub, so that when the struggle comes, we shall have grub distributed in the homes of our people. I don't care a hang for any government or army or navy. They can come along with their bayonets. Bayonets don't cut coal. The combined ideologies of Eccleston Square positively excluded Cook's revolutionary aspirations. Arthur Pugh, for instance, who according to a contemporary might have made a fortune as a chartered accountant but was knighted instead, was typical of the older conservative element on the General Council. Ernest Bevin, dynamic leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, believed that the threat of industrial action was a limited and strictly defensive weapon. The ambitious J.H. Thomas, ex-cabinet minister and secretary of the Railwaymen, viewed the rapid escalation of industrial action with undisguised fear. In September 1925, an inconspicuous article in the Times announced the inauguration of a national volunteer body, the Organization for the Maintenance of Supplies.
This is a form we had to fill in. I remember one doing this quite well. The OMS is neither political nor aggressive. Its purpose is the compilation of a classified register of its members for the use of the government of the day should a state of emergency be declared. The members volunteer in that emergency to assist the government to the best of their ability in the maintenance of law and order and the essential public services, food, heat, light, power, transport, sanitation, etc. Owing to the amount of unrest in the country, the necessity for this organization must be apparent to all loyal citizens.
The Home Secretary congratulated the organizers of the OMS for their patriotic aspirations. Theirs was a useful complement to the government's emergency plans for dividing the country into divisions, each under a civil commissioner with special powers to direct essential services. President of the OMS was one-time Viceroy of India, Lord Harding of Penshurst. The Communist Party denounced the OMS as the most complete scheme of organized blacklegging and strike-breaking yet devised.
I hadn't long been out of the army. I had volunteered while I was still at school, at my public school. Well, having volunteered then, a spirit of patriotism still existed, and here was the country was in difficulties, and I felt, well, it's up to me, I'm young, and a lot of my friends, at that time I was playing rugby for one of the first-class clubs in London, and a lot of the others were all joining either the specials or the underground or doing something, and we all of us were of a similar spirit that we wanted to do something to help the country in this crisis.
The aim of this predominantly middle-class organization was to recruit and train a civilian force of volunteers, ready to muster on receipt of a one-word telegram from Whitehall. Action. The 57th Trade Union Congress reflected a leftward swing in the movement. Militant speeches calling for unity and an end to exploitation internationally were warmly applauded. But the left remained left, only so long as it had to accept no practical obligations. When the vehicle builders moved wider powers of action for the General Council, Thomas and Bevin opposed. "I do not fear to throw such weight as I have on the side of caution," said Kleins. "I am not in fear of the capitalist class. The only class I fear is my own." Socialism, said MacDonald at the Labour Party conference, is the idea of the political state acting more and more in cooperation with the industrial state. "We transcend the conflict of classes," said Cramp, splitting the unions from their party. "We ask for the cooperation of all classes." MacDonald then launched his own attack on the left and secured the expulsion from the Labour Party of all known communists. The Home Secretary reacted promptly with a raid on King Street and the arrest of 12 leading communists. At the first political trial since the war, the 12 were charged with sedition and sentenced to jail. Membership of the Communist Party rose immediately. But the Council remained poised on the high wire of opportunism, still hoping to avoid a final confrontation.
A number of our people thought, well, it'll be avoided, there'll be some way of avoiding it. It was a tremendous thing to have a strike of this dimensions. Let's see whether we can't, as it were, negotiate something out of it.
There's nobody knows the cruelty that we stood up to as young lads. Your mother used to have to wash your back when you got home, and mine she had to be very careful because it had scabbed with hitting the top, with hitting the roof. We see the top, you see. And your short used to get stuck into it as well. And the scab used to get on, you used to try and avoid knocking it off. But it was impossible, man. And the wet off the roof, dropping onto you, and the raggy planks bumping them, and the water over the shoe tops. You know what, you couldn't describe it. They wouldn't do these things today. We were just bloody slaves, man, that's what we were.
In my generation, I mean, you had this love and this trust and this absolute dependency on people who were doing things with hard work with their hands. I mean, you didn't look down on them for doing it, and you didn't look up to them for doing it. They did it. You didn't, they did. And when they suddenly stopped, well, your world very nearly stopped too.
I've seen some wet places there in the Waterloo seam where the ponies, they was knee deep in mud and the ponies could hardly wag their tails. I mean, it sounds a bit tall, but...
The miners put their case to the new commission, on which they had no representation whatever. It included Sir Herbert Samuel, retired High Commissioner in Palestine; Sir William Beveridge, economist, one-time employee of the coal-owning Duke of Northumberland; General Sir Herbert Lawrence, wartime Chief of Staff, now a banker; Kenneth Lee, chairman of a cotton empire and a district bank. The Samuel Commission published its Blue Book on March 10, 1926. It encouraged the coal owners to reorganize their industry on a voluntary basis, without government assistance. For coal miners, it recommended useful benefits, but in the future. Right now, they were urged to accept wage cuts for as long as it took to make the industry economically viable. On Tuesday, April 27th, the TUC made tentative plans for a national stoppage.
The council was itself very much a right-wing council, but still a trade union council. And all the trade union leaders felt miners first, the rest of us afterwards. This is how they got themselves in the situation where the only way to support the miners was to call a strike in their support. Their idea was call out all the frontline workers, all the workers in heavy industry, to bring pressure upon the government maintain or to restore the standard of living of the miners. And of course, the more they pressed this upon each other, and the more they pressed this upon their trade unions, the more they put themselves into a situation of being an alternative source of power to the government itself.
On Thursday, April 29th, the TUC called a special conference of executives representing 141 unions to decide how to carry out their support for the miners. Meanwhile, the Industrial Committee was in and out of Downing Street, desperately trying to find a peace formula that would satisfy the miners on the eve of the lockout.
The miners weren't asking for anything. They were only asking for to keep what they had as a result of the fight for 100 years. And the coal owners said, no, you're going back. And we can't afford to let you have these 7 hours.
As the government subsidy expired, the lockout came into force.
The pit will be open at these prices. And the prices was about 20% of your wages. And if you didn't accept, then you were locked out. But we wouldn't stand it. The miners wouldn't stand it. And that's how the general strike came about.
The King motored back from Newmarket to be available for consultation. The appeal for volunteers was speeded up. "Keep steady," said Baldwin. "Remember that peace on earth comes to men of goodwill."
I was in the Guards at the time, Prince of Wales Company Welsh Guards, when this strike commenced. All leave was stopped, and we were ordered to change ourselves into a battle order and stand by in various states of readiness.
I had a friend of ours. He was in a territorial army, and he was called up. And I met him one weekend, and I says, "Where are you stationed?" "Oh," he says, "I'm stationed on Stanhope, round about the moor." I said, "Well," I says, "that's a funny place to put troops." "Well," he says, "they're there for the try and give work, provide business for the villages and the pubs and the shopkeepers and that." But, were they? Naturally they weren't. They were there because they were expecting trouble.
May Day 1926 was like no other. A massive turnout of workers at Hyde Park awaited news from their leaders. At Memorial Hall, delegates representing 3.5 million workers voted in favor of giving the General Council special powers to coordinate action, to take effect on Monday, May 3rd. The King proclaimed a state of emergency under the 1920 Emergency Powers Act. On the night of May 2nd, an unofficial dispute erupted at the Daily Mail, when workers refused to print a blatant attack on the trade unions. Their editor, Thomas Marlowe, an extreme right-wing Tory, immediately reported the incident to Downing Street by telephone. "It's a direct challenge," said Baldwin. "I'm sorry. This is the end." In the early hours of May 3rd, when the TUC delegation arrived at Downing Street with an explanation, they were informed that the Prime Minister had already gone to bed.
The deputation arrived to talk to him about the conditions on which the strike might be called off, and could the TU delegates break in and put him out of bed? No, this was not protocol. This was done in a grave political situation. So one chap in bed upstairs, and trade union delegation on the doorstep, unable to break through into some kind of political communication with the head of the nation. The strike was on.
Troop reinforcements were drafted to London, South Wales, Lancashire and Scotland. Hyde Park was turned into a food and fuel depot overnight. The OMS handed over its organization to the government, and the well-lubricated machine of the state was thrust into action. Pit ponies suddenly were liberated from the darkness. Under the same sun that scorched the pastures lay battleships at anchor in the Tyne, the Clyde, the Humber, in Barrow, Middlesbrough, Cardiff, Bristol and Swansea.
Crisis! National emergency! National organization!
Volunteers came to the assistance of the government. Work on the railways was taken over by amateur engine drivers, guards, porters and signalmen. Food was rushed by lorries under convoy to places which had run short of supplies. How long could this state of things go on? The man in the street was beginning to grumble. More volunteers offered their help to end this public nuisance.
In 1926, a woman's clothing weighed 30 ounces.
The sketch, May 12th. At the ball given by Lady Aberconway in Belgrave Square, Miss Rosalind Norman looked girlish and attractive in rose pink and white chiffon, while Lady Norman was in wine-coloured georgette, embroidered in silver, and Lady Aberconway wore turquoise blue. Dancing took place in the drawing rooms.
National paralysis.
The general strike had a very ominous sound. Trotsky declared that a general strike brought about the Russian Revolution. I was really nervous. was within a few minutes of the announcement, a black fog settled down over London. The darkness was symbolical. Trains stopped. Everything stopped. Not a sound. Well, man, when you turned out on a morning, you couldn't think that you were alive. You didn't know what was the matter with you. So much quietness, you know, and the sun was shining. We had lovely weather.
Merseyside to TUC. Strike extending hourly. Spirits high. Mills stopping all over the port. St Helens to TUC. Everything stopped, including station, trams, wire works, chemical works. Stockport to TUC. Locomotives, engine men and firemen are 100% out and as solid as the Rock of Gibraltar.
We were backing the miners. We felt that the miners had had a very, very dirty deal from the government.
And I remember going back to this small railway station. Even the station master came out on strike with us, which was very unusual at the time.
Grays to TUC. All union men on strike, spirits very high. Barking. All men on strike, spirits very high. Alvescott to TUC. All out here. God help us if we lose.
Well, actually, in the docks, we always look back upon the general strike.
It brought peace to the docks for another 20 years. And I've always said, when people have said you'll have a strike after the war, when we had strikes going on, I said, well, let them get on with it, let them have a general strike. I would welcome it. It would mean peace for a bit once they were soundly beaten.
May 1926, the general strike. Newspapers cease printing on the stroke of midnight. At Labour headquarters, the TUC orders nationwide down tools. Everybody has to foot it to work. Millions volunteer against this menace to liberty. Armored cars escort food convoys. The gigantic milk pool functions from Hyde Park. Babies at least will have their milk. British people have shown once again they will not stand tyranny. The strikers' attempted station is a damp squiff.
The will to work.
First steps in hiking.
Hello, girl. Can we give you a lift?
Thanks awfully.
How far are you going?
The cabinet decided that cricket should continue, and a test match against Australia brought capacity crowds to the Oval. The first issue of the British Gazette appeared on the streets on May 5th. At the offices of the Morning Post, artists, coffee planters, doctors, clerks and other volunteers published the government's mouthpiece under the intemperate editorship of Winston Churchill. The Gazette proved less difficult to print than to distribute. Despite the use of air transport, many towns never set eyes on a copy.
The aeroplane came over, and of course it must have been very difficult for them to think how they could get it delivered in Durham, because nobody had any sympathy for it. And when they saw us all playing in the playing field, I suppose they would think we were upper class because we were all in school uniform. So they circled once or twice, and then we saw the parcel drop out, and it landed in the field next to the playing field. And immediately, of course, the older children realised what it was, and the sixth form boys up over the wall and went and got it. And of course, the people in the aeroplane, they must have thought that we would go out and deliver it immediately. And there may have been a bit of argument about it, but the boys took it all into the schoolyard at the back of the school, opened them out and lit them, and there was a very big bonfire.
The strikers also had a newspaper, the timid British Worker, official organ of the TUC, incomparably milder than the local news bulletins printed by strikers all over the country. Initial feelings of euphoria among workers soon gave way to determined optimism. There were tasks to be done, and done well if the strike was to succeed. Coordinating these activities day by day at local level was the responsibility of strike committees and councils of action.
I have not really been here since 1926, 46 or 47 years ago. And this was the room where the Council of Action actually functioned. And we began on the morning of May the 3rd with, what, 2 men and a boy, not really knowing what to do. And what we did was to set up a systematic organization. It was extraordinary how spontaneous it was and how quickly it came into being.
Delegates came from every trade union branch in the district. Trammen, busmen, railwaymen, all the various sections, engineers and so on. And at 11 o'clock, the Council of Action met in the Railway Institute in the centre of the town.
The committee was responsible for organising dispatch riders to maintain communication with the various bodies, responsible for school children.
A lot of them came from Oxford and from Cambridge. Every other one was wearing the Oxford bag, those extra wide, outsize trousers which the young men of those days affected. And they were thoroughly good fellows. They all mixed very well.
The Council of Action used to meet every morning at 11 o'clock and generally to 2 or 3 in the afternoon. One of their functions was to issue permits for food lorries to come to the town.
We set up a transport department with dispatch riders, both motorcyclists and cyclists, car for ferrying people about. We had a trade union picketing department.
All of these activities required reports to be given, advice to be given to pickets, and in particular to try and learn how the committee stood with regard to the law, because we knew that many of the things were actually illegal as a result of the Emergency Powers Act.
The Councils of Action, or British Soviets as Churchill called them, were a product of the trades councils. Their independent struggle earned them considerable hostility from the TUC.
We had nothing to do with them. The moment we got away from the official movement and we got into all sorts of ad hoc bodies, specially formed with all kinds of people in it, though those councils would have had an official blessing, they would have had a status, and I wouldn't like to have guaranteed that the personnel of those councils was such that we would approve of as trade unionists. There might have been all sorts of people. We'd have brought in political elements, by inference anyway. Oh no, we wanted nothing to do with them.
In practice, the Councils of Action united the entire proletarian movement in a locality.
One day, we went away down to Berkeley New Pit. It was reported that there were some blacklegs had started there. Well, quietly we went away from the full meeting Council of Action, and we marched away down to the stone heap. I says, come around under the stone heap where you've got plenty of ammunition, you see. And about 1:30, the wheels start to go. I says, they're coming up now, the blacklegs. Get yourself plenty of ammunition, there's plenty stones on the heap here. Get ready now. So when the kids came up to the top and they start coming down, I said, let them get down the ladder to come over to the lorries. And they did, and I says, get stuck into the fire, so they did. Oh, the stones went off that stone heap.
2LO calling. Broadcasting becomes a national service.
Here is the last news bulletin for today. General Situation Section.
It was a new force in society, and I think nobody recognized what a force it was until the strike itself took place. It was regarded as a means of entertainment before that, but it was seen, certainly after the strike, to have been the major political weapon accessible to the government.
Tomorrow, Wednesday, and the cessation of the milk pool in Hyde Park.
Intelligence, Newark to TUC. BBC broadcast today rioting at Newark. Strikers hold up train but dispersed by police. No truth whatever in this statement. All our men accounted for. Can anything be done with BBC to ensure truth of what is broadcast? It was the actions of the volunteers that most angered the strikers.
And the trams could never sally forth very far down the line because the strikers, they screwed nuts and bolts into the central line which carried the power. And so as the tram drove down, then its whole understructure which organized the power was stripped off it. And there were disabled trams, like disabled tanks, standing around in various parts.
Many card-carrying fascists enrolled as special constables, and where they went, class-conscious and provocative, violence invariably followed.
A friend of mine, she lived in Grosvenor Place, and one night she woke up. She got out of bed, looked out, and there were crowds and crowds walking, marching, singing up to Hyde Park Corner. And she thought to herself, this is the revolution.
On Tuesday, May 6th, in the House of Commons, Liberal lawyer and MP Sir John Simon denounced the strike as an illegal act. The decision of the Council of the Trade Union Executive to call out everybody, regardless of the contracts which those workmen had made, was not a lawful act at all. Every workman who was bound by a contract to give notice before he left work and who, in view of that decision, has either chosen of his own free will or has felt compelled to come out by leaving his employment without proper notice, has broken the law.
And really that did shake them. In those days there was a great respect for authority and a great deal of fear too, which was all very right and proper.
Whether good law or bad, Simon's speech had a profound effect on the union leaders. No one on the General Council relished the prospect of unlimited fines, let alone jail.
It is necessary that the Catholics should have clearly before their minds the moral principles which are involved. First, there is no moral justification for a general strike of this character. It is a direct challenge to a lawfully constituted authority and inflicts, without adequate reason, immense discomfort and injury on millions of our fellow countrymen. It is therefore a sin against the obedience which we owe to God, who is the source of that authority, and against the charity and brotherly love which we owe to our brethren. Second, all are bound to uphold and assist the government, which is the lawfully constituted authority in the country and represents, therefore, in its own appointed sphere, the authority of God himself. Third, as God alone.
In the northeast, where negotiations between the civil commissioner and the local strike committee had broken down, police action became extremely violent. In Birmingham, the strike committee was arrested to a man. Bitterness was mounting. In Hull, where a detachment of Sheffield police had been stationed throughout the emergency, violence is vividly remembered.
I was getting prepared for my wedding on the 15th of May, making for the market to order flowers. And as we were walking along, we saw this beautiful sight of the police on horseback coming over the Monument Bridge. And the sun was shining on the helmets. We thought how marvellous it looked. Within a few minutes, it was terrifying.
So the officer in charge gave the order. Clear them up, he said. Just like that. And they advanced on the mob.
The purpose was to stick clear of Victoria Square of all those people and get them home to their beds. Well, you can just imagine a young couple like that with dodging stones. So throwing stones, smashing windows.
There was no violence. People were just shouting and jeering. In my opinion, it was unprovoked. And I think 3 or 4 dozen local men could have dispersed that crowd with a customary move on please. But no, they went in with such savagery that I'm still embittered to this day at the attitude and actions of the police.
The people all ran in all directions, and police were hitting them, and then the horses came trampling over them.
Well, we got them on the move.
They were downing anybody or everybody with their batons as they were running along.
It was like a battlefield down here.
We're going through the crowd like it's died. They had big long batons. I should say they was about 3 foot long.
It's been the magic wand.
Used to swing them down each side of the horse's head. Each side, they just go through the crowd.
And my uncle just happened to get this truncheon across his head, and his pipe fell out of his mouth. He was on his back, he was unconscious, and if I can remember, I believe it was as many as 15 stitches. The fracture was from the top of the skull to just over his eye, and it was shaped just like a snake.
The police absolutely went mad. An elderly couple was walking along, and she lost her hat, did the lady, and she ran back naturally to pick it up, and the policeman just downed her with his truncheon. Her husband turned round and went back to follow her to help her to get her hat back, and they downed him the same way with the truncheon, clean across the neck.
Well, they're supposed to hit here and break this collarbone, you know, the small bone.
The police had really impressed upon the public that they were the masters, and it was a callous way to do it.
Taking it all round, the General Strike was a very well-mannered and very good-tempered difference of opinion. I think it was typically English. We say we're not a lot of bloody wops, we know what we want and we go for it. And we keep ourselves to ourselves and we get what we want.
From Italy, Sir Herbert Samuel returned to London to find negotiations at a standstill. He decided to intervene in a private capacity, as he recalls.
I got into touch with J.H. Thomas, who was the leader of the railwaymen and one of the inner committee that was looking after the whole matter on behalf of the Trade Union Council. And he very warmly welcomed my intervention. I'd known him for years, and said that he would put me in touch with his colleagues, which he did.
Unknown to the miners, secret meetings between Samuel and the Industrial Committee took place at a house in Bryanston Square, the home of a South African mining millionaire, friend of J.H. Thomas. Selby Strike Committee, 11th May. Spirit of men splendid. Believe no rumours. Trust your leaders and win. Lowestoft Strike Bulletin. Trust the TUC. We shall pull through.
The strike was enormously successful. Despite all our quarrels and difficulties in the Council of Action and our exhaustion at working about 24 hours a day, we were elated with the with her situation. And we heard from all over the country where our trades councils and councils of action were reporting similar successes.
And everybody was enthusiastic. You could walk along the main street and people were walking along almost in holiday mood. The workers were confident that they would win.
After a series of meetings, a new negotiating document emerged.
The Samuel Memorandum. That put forward terms which we thought were reasonable. We put those terms to the miners. The miners said, this means a reduction for us, and we're not having it. The council said, you simply cannot maintain that position. See? That we think these terms are the best you can possibly get.
A new suit of clothes for the same body, and no guarantee that the government will honour it. An ultimatum to us miners, bidding us to surrender too.
When we found that the miners who had given us an undertaking with the other unions to give the power to the General Council to settle the dispute, power to end the dispute, on such terms as the council found desirable, when we found that the miners weren't going to adhere to that, and they wanted to determine what the term it should be for the whole movement, we decided no, and I advocated very strongly inside the council. I advocated calling off the stoppage right away.
We began to hear rumours that the strike was over, and we couldn't understand these. On the morning of that last day, we had not had any dispatch from the TUC which told us that the strike was in any way over or in any way in danger of being called off. There have been lots of rumours about negotiations behind the scenes and so on, but we discounted them all.
We printed more posters saying the Council of Action will tell you all the information that's to be got. Don't believe anyone else. The general strike is on, not off. And this occurred again on the Wednesday morning.
I came in here on Wednesday morning, May the 12th, to run my messages, when down from these stairs came Arthur Pugh, the chairman, and Ernest Bevan, and Walter Citrine, the general secretary, and others, and they all came down looking very happy and cheerful, and so they just came out of their club and had a nice morning. And this made me feel rather cheerful, because all my experiences had been that the strike was going very well indeed.
Downing Street, Jimmy Thomas brings the TUC peace offer. The common sense of level-headed Englishmen has won the day. Calamity is averted. Best-fallen leaders of the TUC leave number 10. After 9 days, the strike is over, and best men rush to print the news.
Rob was ready to burst into tears. I almost felt that, the bottom had dropped out of our world, and I had this feeling of it being, a great betrayal of all the sacrifices that everyone had made, that everyone that I had seen in different parts of London, particularly in the East End, that here was the end, they had fought for, they had got nothing, and this was indeed the great betrayal.
Well, I don't know who betrayed whom. I know nothing about betrayal. I never heard the word mentioned in my presence. I might have heard a few things perhaps in the communist papers or...
These people, the General Council, they've got themselves in a revolutionary position, and they weren't revolutionaries. And they got frightened. And they had to extricate themselves fast, which they did do. And they came out, gave it up unconditionally.
This is London calling the British Isles. We have just received the news that the general strike has been called off by the leaders of the Trades Union Council.
A lot of us wouldn't believe it. Everything was confusion. We didn't know if the General Council had got any suitable terms or not. The Daily Herald came out on Thursday with banner headlines: Great victory for the general strike.
It was, in fact, an unconditional surrender.
Back to work. Back to work.
The miner knew he'd lost, and the railwaymen went back, in my opinion. They was railwaymen, they was miners. They and them, instead of we. It used to be we. I remember when it was we.
The miners were to continue the struggle alone for 7 painful months, until starvation was to drive them back to work for whatever wages they were offered.
Victimisation was rife all over. Stanley Baldwin winked his eye, the employers nodded their heads, and the screw was on. I'm not blaming Stanley Baldwin for the depression, but I'm blaming him for the treatment that the workers received from then on. They had carte blanche to cut wages where they could and impose any condition alike, which they did do. Over there was a statue of William Wilberforce. He abolished slavery in the British Empire. That was a laugh.
The retreat of the General Council opened a new era of collaboration with the employer and the state. From having been the highest expression of organized labor, the TUC almost imperceptibly became an essential part of the bureaucracy of government.
Well, I think, having regard to everything, it ended very fairly, and in a very British manner.
That was what beat the miners. Starvation. It wasn't that the spirit wasn't there. It was. Only the miners couldn't face starvation. And therefore we just had to wind up.
Though officially the strike was over, a further 100,000 men came out on May 13th. The mood was to continue. Open victimization by employers was strenuously resisted by councils of action and strike committees in many areas. Although this spontaneous movement marked an important break with the defeated leadership at Eccleston Square, it was soon smothered by confusion.
Back to work! Back to work! Back to work!
When I got back there, the station master gave me a form to sign. The conditions of my re-entry back to the railway staff was that I signed this form, and that on any future occasion that I did come on strike, that this would signify that I'd have immediate dismissal and would not be re-employed again by the railways.
Went to the collie office at Buick Maid, And I led them, of course, you know, we're going to arrange for the men to start. But what a sucker I got. He says, you're getting out of this pit yard. You're not allowed on these premises, and you're not going to get a start here.
He said, if you're prepared to give up your socialism, socialist ideals, he says, get work tomorrow. I said, I'm not giving up my ideals for any man or any job.
Who's ever said it was a defeat? A defeat by whom? What happened? Was the £400 million loss to the country a defeat? Was the 80 million loss to the Exchequer a defeat? I don't think so. I have never said it was a defeat. It marked a turning point in British industrial history, and I was proud to be associated with it.
The Tories were not content with victory in 1926. The economy was in chaos and unemployment was out of control. In 1927, they passed the Punitive Trade Disputes Act, which weakened the union still further and undermined the Labour Party's economic base. The Labour Party, unable to reconcile the aspirations of its founders with the requirements of capitalism, reached what appeared to be the pinnacle of reformism in 1931 with the return of a national government. The cabinet included MacDonald, Thomas, Snowden, Simon, Samuel, Chamberlain, and Stanley Baldwin.